You're listening to Factual America. It's a great film. I really enjoyed it. But you pose a question. You mentioned David Garrow, who, as you said, you worked closely with on Eyes on the Prize, and who features prominently in this film. And you posed a question to him that I thought was really interesting right at the end of the film, and I'm going to paraphrase it and pose it to you, which is, what is your responsibility as a filmmaker when making a film about someone like MLK?
Yeah, here's my answer. My responsibility is to try to tell a story that's complex and nuanced and not to whitewash it. Not to make a hagiography about Dr. King or anybody who I may admire or respect. I always want to be able to dig into the human being and see that they have their own particular moral, what I call human flaws. And so for me, the responsibility I felt that I had, and Ben Hadeen, a producer, or that he also felt he had, was to tell a story, a complex, nuanced story about Dr. King and the things that he had to confront. He was not only dealing with being a leader of the civil rights movement, he was dealing with his own personal demons, his own, his liaisons with other women. He was dealing with the fact that at a certain point in his trajectory, he decided to come out against Vietnam, and understanding the kind of pushback and backlash he would get from doing that, not only from the white community, but from within the Black community. The understanding that he wanted to try to understand that the notion for civil rights was also about economic rights. And that's why he felt he needed to have to create the Poor People's March. The fact that, he was a man who was constantly multitasking. You can see the weariness in his face as this film unfolds, as he's moving through the years, dealing with different things, from going to Birmingham, going to Albany, Georgia, going to Selma, going to Chicago, going to, Oslo to get the Nobel Peace Prize, coming back to America, having to deal with J. Edgar Hoover. This man had a very complicated life. And I felt that we had the responsibility to show it. Now, does it make him look like the saint that everybody has sort of painted him to be? No, I just think it shows him as a human being, as much as we try to show Hoover as a human being too. Yeah. And I think that's my responsibility as a filmmaker.
And if I may say so myself, I think you do that extremely well, because I think what comes out to me is that ultimately this film is about the complexity of human beings. Yeah. I mean, yes, there's a story about MLK and J. Edgar Hoover, but and we do put our heroes on pedestals. And you've already mentioned JFK and things that we didn't know, that people didn't know about at the time. Maybe, and you've also alluded to, is that we've completely separated people's personal character and life and character from what we think about them as, or what happens to them as politicians. But maybe that's gone too far to the other extreme. We need to understand that great things can be achieved by flawed people.
Exactly. That's a great phrase. That's the way you just said it. Great things can be accomplished by flawed people. And that's always been the trajectory. Yeah. It's never been like one person is one thing or the other. They're complicated. Yeah. If you go back in American history to George Washington, to Thomas Jefferson, to Abraham Lincoln, up through the centuries, every one of these men in America that have been considered great American heroes were flawed human beings. Yeah.
And we've wanted to make, and so all these myths, and it was like, if you think about George Washington, you have all these myths develop that
always. This goes back to a John Ford film I watched that came out in 1948 called Fort Apache, with Henry Fonda and John Wayne. And Henry Fonda was a crazed colonel who basically took his men to slaughter. And at the very end of the film, when John Wayne has taken over his command, he's being interviewed by the journalist, and Ford did this with The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and he says, when you print the legend or you print the real story, and a lot of times you print the legend, knowing what the real story is,
So how did you then go about telling this story? Because as I think you've already made mention of this, about what you look for now in terms of stories and films. And for listeners, this isn't a biopic. It's a story with a clear protagonist and antagonist, as we've discussed, each with their fatal flaws, and each with their own view of what America's meant to be.
Exactly. You said it.
Yeah.
That was the charge, and that was the charge. When we did our first cut of the film, which was over 2.5 hours, the
Wow.
challenge was to make sure that we kept that trajectory going, the protagonist and the antagonist, all the way through up to the assassination of Dr. King, and then with the epilogue, what does it all mean? You know, and so we had put in a lot of stuff in the 2.5 hour version that looked at King's sort of trials and tribulations in Albany, in Birmingham, and even in Chicago. And we felt that, and we even did more on the Black Power movement with the FBI. But we felt as we started to narrow it down, we had to sharpen the narrative. We had to focus it more to make sure that, the two men who are at the center of the story, that their stories and the context of what they were involved in comes through even more strongly. I mean, we even had a whole section that dealt with people that were part of the Communist Party, the group called the Solo Brothers, who were connected to Stanley Levinson. That was sort of set up J. Edgar Hoover wanting to really understand the arc of the Communist Party, his obsession with the Communist Party, which we had to lose. I mean, so
Yeah.
we really had to really sharpen the narrative, which is really, the part of all of us as filmmakers. We're always trying to figure out how to sharpen our narrative
Yeah.
in telling our story.